Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Tim McGuinness. I'm a director of the Society of Citizens Against Relationship Scams, a government-registered nonprofit organization based in Miami, Florida, also in Monterrey, Mexico, Nuevo Leon, Mexico. Today, we're going to have a conversation between Sharon Armstrong, who is also a director of SCARS from New Zealand, and Debby Montgomery Johnson, another director of SCARS from Palm Beach, Florida, and myself from Miami, Florida. It's been a while since we've talked to Sharon, and Sharon is an unbelievable advocate for scam victims, their rights, their recovery, and an incredible educator on the subject from her base in New Zealand. Welcome, Sharon.
Kia ora. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. We don't speak Maori, but you're welcome to interject as much as you like. Just excuse the blank expressions on our face when you do.
That's right.
Debby.
I'll try and translate.
All right.
I do.
Welcome, Debby.
Thank you very much, Tim. Nice to be
All right. So today, we wanted to talk to Sharon about everybody asks about her scam. We're not going to ask that today. Instead, what I wanted to talk to Sharon about a little bit was there's been several documentaries and movies made about your experience, so we don't need to go into that. But I think one of the things that is our theme for last week and this week is how do victims tell their stories? And both of you are extraordinarily gifted when it comes to being able to share your story and talk about it. So I wanted to start there because that'll also then segue into why is it so difficult for us to educate the public about scams? But I believe that it starts with two fundamental problems. One is getting more people to talk about their experience, because the trend, I believe, is downward in terms of the number of people actually reporting these crimes.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it to be approximately 1%, maybe even less, of scam victims will report these crimes to police and national law enforcement. So that's one massive issue. Governments only know what's reported to them. They don't extrapolate, they don't estimate. So when, for example, someone like the government of Canada says that it's under $200 million lost to scams in 2021 in Canada, it's probably 100 times that. And if in fact government really appreciated the fact that it was 100 times the numbers that they're showing, governments around the world would be frozen in their tracks as to the magnitude of the economic impact that this is having on society. I view it personally as a tax that is resulting in more than the gross domestic product of countries like New Zealand, Australia, Germany combined. We believe that it's a tax of at least $500 billion on the United States alone per year. So, but to go into this concept of how do we begin to get other victims to talk about it, Sharon, do you think that it begins with people like yourself and like Debby becoming spokespeople and being very outspoken about these? And how do you think we get the message across, not about scams, but about the fact that there's nothing to fear in sharing your story?
Really good question, Tim. Big question. It's where to start, I guess. In terms of myself, I knew very early after realizing that I had been a victim of a scam that I wanted something positive to come out of the experience, because everything I was experiencing at that time was negative. And so for those that don't know, made headlines back home. So there was a lot of vilifying that went on, both by the media and by the general public, both in New Zealand and in Argentina, where I'd been arrested.
Right.
And so as I started to work through my own hurt, and I'm not minimizing that at all, because it was a journey. But in terms of that, I knew in the back of my mind somewhere that somehow I was going to do something about this. I didn't quite know what it was at the time. And then about a month or 6 weeks after I'd been arrested, I was contacted by a reporter from home who said that he'd been contacted by a publishing agency, and they had asked him whether he could approach me to see if he could write my story. At that time, I thought, number one, the fact that someone wanted to write a book about it, I found very interesting. But secondly, I just had this overwhelming sense that if anybody was going to tell my story, it had to be me. And I guess that's the point that I'd like to start from, because while there, and Debbie and I were just talking about this before we came on air, while there are a lot of similarities around the setup, the grooming, all of those things that happen, it's about being able to realize, I guess, pretty early on that if you sift through everything, the victims haven't done anything wrong. And I guess that was a bit of a turning point for me, was because that shame is so overwhelming. In our language, in our culture, we have a word called whakama, and that goes even deeper than shame. It covers shame, embarrassment. It's not just about the self, it's about the whole family. It's about your iwi, it's about all the people and your friends. That is the extent of our word whakama. I went through that, but I believe everybody needs to go through the process, but it's how you're dealing with you personally. The first, I remember someone saying, forgiveness begins with yourself. And, they're cliches, and everybody can throw cliches around. But my experience is that is absolutely 100% right. Until you can reach a point where you realize that you didn't do anything wrong, then you're in a position to share your story. And I think one of the biggest fears, feel free to stop me whenever you want. One of the biggest fears we have is that I'm the only person that this happened to, even though people realistically know that there are hundreds, millions of people that have been impacted. When it happens to you, you think, oh my God, how could I have done this? How could I? How could I? How could I? And so it's all about the I, when actually one of the things that I've been incredibly passionate about is that we have to change our focus. We have to stop the focus being on the victims. We have to turn it around so that the focus is on the perpetrators. It's on the criminals. I want to use as strong a word as I can, because scammers almost minimizes what they do.
Exactly.
They're criminals, they are committing crime.
And it isn't a scam, it's fraud.
That's absolutely right, Tim. And I think once we start to lift it to that level of seriousness, then we begin to understand that actually, sorry, I'll just go back one step, because one of the important points I forgot to mention was everybody else's opinion. Now, it's being able to surround yourself in those early days with people that love you, trust you, know you, believe in you, will always believe in you and love you unconditionally, because they're the ones that will get you through this.
Right.
And if you don't have family around you that can provide that, or friends, then you need groups like SCARS. You need groups where people have had a similar experience. And I always use the word similar because no two scams are exactly the same. We all interpret everything in our own way, and there's not one solution to one to solve all of the issues of what happens for people. I'm going to stop now because I feel like I'm, wavering off the topic, as I can easily do, and I'll ask whether I actually answered your question.
Well, so I think you answered a portion of it, which is that it, in your case, was derived from an intense desire to see good come out of your experience, and that also you had a pool of people around you who were very supportive, and that enabled you to talk to, starting with them, more and more openly. And then from that, the issue of your book and the desire to see your story told properly, I think, was very profound. So many of the victims that we talk to, and when you mention support groups, I think it's critically important that, when I started SCARS back in 2015, we started from this very peculiar position of approaching the subject matter from two fundamental positions. One was that the victims were not to blame. Mm-hmm. Victims were traumatized. And as a result, there was a need for forgiveness of themselves and a recognition that the impact of these crimes is extraordinarily severe. And as you may have been aware, we took years of abuse from all the other so-called anti-scam groups. How dare we call scam victims crazy and out of their minds and mentally ill? But that is the reality. And by sticking with that basic message over the years, we've become extraordinarily aware of both the psychology involved in scams, which the hate groups are oblivious to. All they're focused on is exposing, and hating, and hating, and hating. Yeah. And it's incredibly important that victims don't go to these cult-like groups and lose themselves in the process of all of this hate. But as we looked at the psychology of how scams actually happen mechanically, and how everyone is vulnerable, everyone can be scammed, and that by definition, if everyone can be scammed, then how could it be our faults? Because it's not based on any specific wrongdoing. Now, we learned something from the world of recovery, addiction recovery, etc., which is that in order for somebody to forgive themselves, they have to acknowledge at least one wrong. So we look at this as basically that scam victims only make one mistake. They begin a conversation with a stranger. That's it. The minute that conversation begins, they lose control. And the grooming, the manipulation happens. And that's also the one moment when they could have defended themselves. After the conversation began, the grooming, the manipulation began, and they fundamentally lost control. It wasn't their fault. But when people realize the scam, they discover it, as we say. The three steps are avoid, discover, and recover. When people have discovered these scams and begin some process of discovery, they're incredibly afraid, ashamed, traumatized, full of guilt, full of self-blame. And we work strongly on overcoming those, both through our own support activities and by directing victims to trauma counselors and therapists, because in group, talking with other victims is great, but many times there's past traumas, there's past issues that a therapist really will need to work with the victim on in order to better get them through and to a life of enrichment and happiness. So anyway, I spoke almost as long as you did, but so how did you begin the process of telling your story in forums of other victims and in the public? How did that begin for you? What did that feel like?
I guess the beginning was making a conscious decision that while I was, and this was within a week of being locked up, and I may not have manifested that it would end up being a book, but I began to keep a journal, and a daily journal. And aside from being a lifesaver, because it was getting stuff out of my head at that time, and I found it a very cathartic process, the writing. And I mean, I would write stuff that wasn't always relevant to the scam, but, about my day-to-day, what was happening. And so after, I think that's where I'd gone before, after the approach from the reporter wanting to write my story, and I made the decision, I decided that if ever there was a story to be told, I would tell it. And I think that's a really important point, is because we are the only ones that can tell our own story. I can't tell Debby's, I can't tell anybody else's. I can repeat it, but it's her story. So I think that's really important. So I think that's where it began, with the writing of my journal. Then when before I was released from Argentina or sent home, I had these ideas that I would hit the ground running when I got back to New Zealand, and within 12 months, boom, there would be my book. That was incredibly naive of me in many ways. And I had a very good friend who'd provided good media advice for me at the time, because again, I made headlines, and there was an expectation when I was coming home that, the airport would be flooded with media and all sorts of stuff. So I managed to literally fly in under the radar. We agreed to do one story when I got back, and we did it with a women's magazine that had been very supportive of me and written not in a victimizing way, any of the stories they'd written. So we agreed one story with them. The advice she then gave me was take 18 months. She said, step out of it, do no more interviews, nothing else in the media. She said, for 18 months, she said, get your life back, build yourself back up. And at the time I thought, no, I want to hit the ground running. I want to go hard. I am so grateful for that, because although I came back strong, although I came back able to do that interview, able to talk to my family and friends, and was pretty clear about where I was at, I still hadn't completely completed that journey. And I needed to just get back to a normal type of life, get back into a job, the mundane, the 8 to 5, all of that stuff. I needed to go through that again. So I did wait almost that long. So I returned home in October 2013, did the article for the Women's Day magazine at that time, then did nothing else until the July of 2015, and it was a 6-month documentary in the making. I'd been approached by our Indigenous television station here in New Zealand, Māori Television, and by a reporter whom I had a lot of respect for, and she approached me. So we did a very carefully constructed sort of documentary that I felt like I had quite a bit of control over. Now that's important, because if someone else tries to take that level of control, things get twisted. So I was happy with where the story ended, and that they could hear my voice. And I was still pretty naive when I look back now, and I've done a number of interviews and stuff subsequently, but I'm still pretty proud of that, because that was really me putting my hand up saying, hey, all you people that might have forgotten about me, I'm still here, and I'm still going to advocate for this. And I still don't believe I did anything wrong, and I still believe we need to change the focus. So that was really the purpose of that. From that, I then had other opportunities. I then did another documentary called I Am Innocent. I struggled with that when I was first approached, because I never denied the fact that the drugs were in my suitcase. I did, however, never deter from the fact that I was an unwitting drug mule. So, I'm going to lose my train of thought. See?
Okay. I think one of the important things, and Debby, please jump in at any time, but I think one of the important things that you brought up was, even though you did the first article early, first interview early, you had someone who was compassionate and guiding in that, but taking the time to better recover from the experience. And I myself have been arrested once for something that I didn't do. And it's a horrifically traumatizing experience. And especially when you know that you didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, this was done by some other person who couldn't have cared less, and
That's right.
spending 2 years in prison for something that wasn't your fault. Now, using the word innocent is,
That's
I
right.
think, accurate, because
That's
A,
right.
we're under duress, under manipulation, and B, this stuff was planted on you.
That's right, Tim. Yeah. And that's where I got to in the end. I realized that it wasn't innocent of the carrying the drugs. It was actually innocent of attempting to carry those drugs.
Well, it's innocent of a crime.
That's right. And so once I reached that place, I was quite happy to go ahead with that. Now, the importance for me around that was that, again, I was in control. And look, this is a theme for me because I won't do any interviews now with someone I do not trust.
Mm-hmm.
I've been approached by, I won't name them, but by some news outlets that I have no faith in and who have treated me badly in the past. They're on my blacklist. I will not give them an interview. And I'm really, really staunch about that because I'm clear about those media that did support me, or those that may not have supported me in the first instance, but as they grew to know more and they listened more to my story, began to see that there was more to it other than a stupid woman that got caught up in something that she shouldn't have. And so that's one of the things for me now. I'm only interested in doing any interviews, stories, whatever, if I am in control. And I don't mean that I won't answer any questions. People can throw anything at me, but there are certain places now that I won't go. I won't justify, you know, people still say, but I don't understand why you didn't look in that bag. Now I just say, read my book. Or, you know, those things, because I'm not going to rehash all of that again. So I think that's important for people that are recovering, is that it has to be in your own time. You know, for some people, they might recover within a month. It's you know, I always liken it to grief. My first experience was losing my mother at 22 years of age, one of the most significant events in my life. The grief, the process that I went through for years after was immense. And for me, while it's a different journey, you're going through those very similar stages. You're grieving, you're angry, you're all of those things. So when I'm working with victims, I'm encouraging all the time, be angry, be upset, go through those motions, don't deny them. But at the end of the day, be kind to yourself, because that to me is also really important. We have to accept that, you know, I'm still just as trusting, you know, and I'm sure that infuriates my daughter sometimes. But I am just as trusting, because I thought, my God, if I change who I am as a result of this experience, then they've won. You know, I want to be the winner. I want to be the one that says, I've had this experience, I've survived, I'm better off for it. You know, I want that to be my message. I don't want anyone to feel sorry for me. I don't want anybody's pity, sympathy, any of that. I want the understanding of what you said earlier, that everybody is vulnerable, sometimes more so in our lives, and therefore everybody is open to being scared.
Can I just add something here? The word that comes to me here is you're discerning. It's not that you're, you know, you've been through it, I've been through it. And I got to say, we talked about this before once, that we are sisters by other misters. Because so much of what has happened to us, we're running in these parallel lines. You know, it happened about the same time in our lives, the same thing. And the only thing that didn't happen to me was me getting thrown in jail, which, you know, I'm sitting there watching your story going, oh, I'm so grateful that that didn't happen. But it's interesting, when I was first approached about my, you know, getting a book and having it become a movie, because I didn't actually see the guy in person and confront him in person. They're like, well, there's no story. What happens if you go on Oprah? And she asked, well, what was it like when you met him? And I was like, well, I didn't meet him. They're like, well, that's it. I was like, but the ending's not the story. It's what happened that is the story. And it again, it took me some time too. First thing that the reporters told me, and I had an excellent reporter, the very first article, very early on, I was told, don't read what is written about the story, because it's
Mm.
bottom feeders that are coming out at you. And those are the ones, the shamers and the blamers and the naysayers. And one of my girlfriends called me up immediately and said, don't read it. And we called the reporter and she took a lot of it offline. But I've learned that it doesn't matter what other people say. It's like that stink eye that, you know, when you're speaking to someone and they're looking at you cross-eyed going, why the heck did you do that? But the person beside them is bobbing their heads. And that's the person that you start talking to. And that's the person that I think both of us start talking to. And as far as the reporters go, yeah, I had one a couple of weeks ago. As soon as he started speaking, I knew he was going to be condescending as all get out. And you know what? That just gave me the power to speak my voice, to use my voice and to tell him what I understood is what had happened. The other reporter was great. He was there just soaking it in. But this guy, he didn't get it. And it didn't matter to me at that point. Couple of years ago, it would have mattered. That's why it's so important for us to tell our victims who are becoming survivors to take a pause. You don't have to run out and tell your story to the media, because when I went on to national TV and, you know, was called out on national TV for ratings, my daughter calls up and says, well, that was really condescending. I said, you know what? It didn't bother me because I knew what they were going to do and I needed to get the story out as a beware and to be aware kind of a story. It wasn't about me anymore. And I think this is where you and I had the same feeling, that once we got through the story and through the event and found that there were people supporting us. For me, it was a Women's Prosperity Network. It was my family. And when I realized that it wasn't about me anymore, I heard this the other day, someone said it became a pay it forward moment.
Yeah.
And it did. And Tim, I was thinking about this when we were doing our thing this weekend. It's all about paying it forward. It's live what you went through, write it out, you release the emotions of it, and then pay it forward, because there's someone out there that is waiting to hear your story or needs to hear your story before they get involved.
Well, it's what we say in our support groups, that it's not about just participating by clicking a story or something else. You're there receiving free services to help you recover from this traumatic experience. You're receiving support from all the other victims in our support groups. And as you begin to recover, you need to repay that kindness to the other new victims that are coming in, because your experience matters. To sit there in silence is frankly quite objectionable, because if you sit there in silence after having received months of support from others, you're not repaying your kindness.
And we may be the only people that are kind to each other, because we do find that victims can be very judgmental of other victims.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
And that's a shame, because we're here to support each other. You know, we're those sisters in crime that we've been through something that we understand from the inside out. And it's up to us to give, you know, kindness back to somebody else and say, I feel you, but here, I've been through it 10 years now. You've been through it many years. A lot of people have only been through it 3 months. Please listen to what we're saying. We don't mean to be harsh or unkind, but we will get you through this. And in time, you will see the light.
Yep.
There's hope. There's hope at the end of that tunnel.
And you know, one more thing that's important for all victims to really understand is that they're not the only victim.
That's right.
Sharon, it was your daughters and your family who were equally victimized by the criminals. And so often, victims, particularly in their immediate stage, their first 6 months, for example, have great difficulty recognizing that it's anything but them. There is that inward view, and I don't want to characterize it as self-pity, because it's not. It's simply the pain that comes from trauma. But you also have, everyone also has to recognize that others are on this journey with you. If you'll acknowledge that, they actually can be supportive of you. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about in terms of, you know, telling your story to the press, which you've touched on, Sharon, and Debbie has dealt with many times, is really twofold. One, the critics who are abusive and hateful, etc. My personal feeling is that they're primarily afraid that it will happen to them, and this is them responding in denial, and their response is anger and hate, but it's really fear that it's going to happen to them, and it will. Everybody will be scammed at some point, in some way, whether it's buying a fake product or listening to a fake influencer or listening to a politician's lies. It doesn't matter. Everybody will be. Now, the other aspect of doing press interviews that we see constantly is that the majority of the time, these are done by local news media organization, News at 5, News at 10, whatever, and they want to dedicate 30 seconds to a salacious story about this poor woman lost $500,000, and the implication is, how could she ever have let this happen? And by inference, listening to her story will help you avoid scam. It won't help at all, because there's no wisdom that comes out of a story that exploits the victim.
That's right. I remember when, after I launched my book, so talking about those critics, I have seen a reduction in it, certainly in terms of my own case, in that after I launched my book, there was hardly any backlash. In fact, most of what I got was positive feedback. But the most interesting for me was 2 years ago when, a year ago, when they produced the drama went to air, The Tender Trap. Now, the feedback that I got from that, I'm actually trying to recall whether there was anything that fell into that category of patronizing or vilifying. If it is, it doesn't really resonate, which is most unusual because they're usually the ones that you remember more than anything. Those that I do remember that gave feedback, majority was incredibly positive. Majority of them would come and say, oh my God, this so could have happened to me. I can see now that, what was happening for me, I could have ended up in this place. So there was lots of realization for people that they'd been in a similar space. But the ones that warmed my heart the most and made every nasty comment ever made against me worth it was those that came back and apologized for that behavior. Those that came back and said, my God, back in 2011, I was one of those that said, lock her up and throw away the key. I was one of those that said, stupid woman, serves her right. And now after having watched that drama, I realize that could happen to anybody. Now, for me, that was the winner. That's the whole driver of, why I've done any of this, is because I don't ever want anybody to be vilified in the way that I was. I also don't want anybody to ever continue to live their life as a victim of some people that couldn't give a continental about them, their family, or anything about them. So why would we sacrifice, so much goodness in our lives over to those idiots, those criminals that do those sorts of things? One of the things I keep saying to my victims is that any scammer, they're only there to extort, whether it be your love, money, extort for any other reason, but extortion is just the undercurrent, the deception and the extortion that they go through is just, it's mind-blowing. As you've said, Tim, billions upon billions, but where to from here?
What I found was really interesting and encouraging, though, from your story, from the document, I don't think it was a documentary, it was the story, it was the reaction of law enforcement and the criminal justice system. And I felt they were very positive. The women that you worked with were very positive in helping you. And I saw that when I was in Dallas for the sentencing of a criminal out in Dallas in the federal court system, where we finally had the prosecutors and the judge and everybody listening to the victim's story. And that for me was the lightning moment of, you know, that's why it's so important to report, because even though we kept saying, they're not listening, they're not doing anything, when I saw what they did in creating the case, it was just so remarkable and confirming to me that that's why we report, that's why we stand up, and that's why you didn't give up, or your family didn't give up. And they, you know, you unfortunately had to put in that time, but, you know, looking back on it, it was probably one of those moments where those years where, you know, it defines you, but it doesn't, it's not it's not you, it's your story, but it's not you. But what is you is the strength that you got out of that. And now you're an incredible advocate and voice for those that can't speak up. And I'd want you in my corner.
You know, Sharon, there's something you might not have considered, but the process that you went through in Argentina and the complete negation of your story by the courts in Argentina, eventually they freed you. And as a part of that, we actually have heard from other mules in Argentina who've actually not been prosecuted because there is legal precedent now in Argentina. And this is actually happening in many places in Latin America, that manner of speaking, you became the precedent for other mules to be able to stand up and say, I was not responsible. I was being a victim of organized criminals in a way, because the general rule is that if you're a drug mule and you're unwitting and you show up at the airport, generally you're not going to be charged if that can be confirmed. But in your particular case, Argentina was extraordinarily severe with you. But I believe that this situation is changing. Now, it's been almost a decade, and you're absolutely right. We are hearing less hate towards victims. We're hearing much more professionalism in the police and the judicial system. They become much more aware of this. Now, I wanted to go back to an original question that we had, which was, you know, partly, how do we get more victims to tell their story? And two, how do we reach the public more effectively? I personally think that all of the public service announcements and videos that we will produce, they've all been a complete failure. Just as all cybercrime education, whether it's at the individual level or at the corporate level, has also been a complete failure. I think the only thing that people remember are stories that are told to them by people who've experienced. In other words, only the wise can communicate how to avoid these crimes and how to effectively recover from it. So how do we get more victims just to talk to their family and friends? Because if every victim would tell two people, and those people told two people, within a year, these scams would be reduced by 99%.
Yeah, it's a big question, Tim. I think one of the things that still worries me is there's still this culture in society where, and not just to do with scams, but for some reason in society, we're always quick to blame a victim. And you know, I've pondered this question for the last decade. I have to wonder whether part of the reason is because that's easier.
It is.
It's
also a little bit of tall poppy syndrome.
And, you know, and I think, why is it that we want to, it is that tall poppy. Why do we want to keep pulling people down? You know, we should be building them up. And I guess in response to your question, just while you were talking, I was thinking, wouldn't it be great to create some sort, and I don't know whether it's even been done, but some sort of channel, and you know, maybe it is scarce because of the network that is out there now, but, you know, a channel where, a setup similar to this, where, you know, some of us that have been through the recovery, everything else, and have come right out the other side, are sitting and having just a conversation with the victim, with their permission, of course, with the victim, and encouraging them to tell their story. And we just build a library or build a whole lot of these videos that we can put up on a website for anybody to view, and they can listen to these stories. But also eventually, it may make something. I'm not quite sure what it might make, but something. I think if we stop talking about it, it'll get worse. If we, it is that thing about when I agreed to do the drama, and I had the biggest conversation with, and primarily women were involved in the creation of it. At the end of it, they asked me all sorts of questions, personal questions, the whole lot, no holes barred. I said, look, you ask me anything you want. I want to be honest. I want this to be a true, replication of what happened to me. At the end of it, and they did ask some really hard questions. And at the end of it, though, every single one of those women, there were probably 7 of them in the conversation, said to me, my God, Sharon, this so could have happened to me. Now it's that penny drop. It's that moment where a person thinks, oh, holy heck, yes, this could have happened to me. So I think when we get that breakthrough, then people are more open to listening to people's stories. They're then open to understanding more. It's those that still troll the internet. We're never going to change them. I've no intention. I don't even deal with them. I don't respond. I don't do anything. Any of the negative comments I never buy into. I'm just so over it, because it's just not worth my energy. My energy needs to go in those that want to do something constructive, those that believe in us, those that listen to our stories and go, oh my God, that's just so traumatic. Because you're right, it is the trauma at the basis of it. That's how they get us.
Well, I think what's happening too is not that people that I was talking to at the very beginning, they're like, oh, it's never going to happen to me. So I moved it on now. So, well, what if it were to happen to your mom or your daughter or your best friend? Because that's what I'm hearing now. I'll have a friend call.
Remember the guys, father, brother, uncle,
father, son,
happens too.
But I had a woman call me and say, hey, my neighbor just called and said she wants help taking a picture of her credit card so she can send it to a friend. I'm like, oh, stop. Well, then by the time she got there, the woman didn't believe that it was a scammer, and she gave the guy the numbers. So it's a matter of just speaking up. And I think what I've found too is that some of the original reporters, we've been doing this for 5-6 years now. They're coming back and saying, I had one the other day, local CBS channel. He came back and he goes, I'm now not doing the 3 minutes, the 3-minute segments. I can do an extended series, and I'm doing a revisit of your story. And he came over and we did another revisit on where I am today and what I'm doing. And he said, it's extraordinary that you kept with this, and that you made it your passion, your mission to keep talking. And when you get time to do the writing and the videos and all that, I said, we make time. It's important, because it is easier just to stop and say, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want anybody to know about it. It's, we could have done that, but that's not who we are. And that's not why it happened in our particular cases, So we're not the saviors, but we can certainly be the voice to alert that it's still happening in a much bigger way than when it happened to us, and in different ways to a lot of different people.
Sharon, your point earlier about doing more interviews like this, we constantly ask members of our support group, people, we've had a little under 12,000 people go through our support groups over the last 7 years. And we go back to many of them. We actually have a full skill program being developed right now where we're going to go back and survey them to try and get a better understanding of the role that we played in their recovery, what other services they may have utilized, therapy, counseling, etc. But for example, we tried to put together just a roundtable conversation of individuals, and we would not identify anybody by name, and they could even sit in a dark room so they couldn't even be clearly seen. Nobody would participate because so much residual fear and shame that their employers will find out, their family and friends. And what it tells us is they're not making the leap to true forgiveness and acceptance. And because of that residual fear, that residual shame, that residual concern, they're afraid of exposure for all of the reasons that, you know, we all tell people, you have to get past this. You can't let judgment be a barrier to you, because truth is, nobody should be afraid of being judged. Everybody is judged all the time by everyone. It's just part of life. So you just ignore the judgments that don't make sense and rely upon those that judge you for who you really are. But we very much would like to do this, and we're also thinking about ways, how do we open this up? We have our weekly Zoom calls, which are very productive. But even so, that's completely confidential and closed. But we only get about 15%, 20% of our support group members participating. The other 70% never participate. And that's the crux of the challenge. So for the last couple of weeks, we've made a focus to begin talking about, how do you talk about these crimes? And I think that we're where sexual assault or domestic abuse was about 30 years ago.
Yes.
And even drunk driving, you know, Mothers Against Drunk Driving are almost 30 years old now. It's astounding that it's taken that long, but we've been at this now for about 10 years. SCARS for about almost 8. I myself for 31 years, but as you chastised me once about 7 years ago, my orientation has gone through a significant change as I better appreciated the psychology of what's going on, both in terms of the victim's own psychology and the psychology of manipulation and grooming. Because I'm a scam victim. I was scammed in 2000. I didn't lose, or 2001. I didn't lose money. I told my story. It's on our website. But I wasn't traumatized by that experience. Well, at least very short-lived after 9/11 and the realization I'd been talking to Afghanistan. But, you know, once it was clear I wasn't going to jail, okay, that was over. But I think this is the greatest challenge that we face now, is helping victims set aside that shame, set aside that fear, set aside their paranoia of judgment. And I wanted to talk with you and Debbie in this conversation about these topics. And then we're having another webinar next Saturday at 11 a.m. US Eastern Time, hint, 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 about how do you talk to family and friends. Too much information is too much information. So maybe we could touch on that for a moment. When you began to talk to people, how did you limit the amount of information that you were comfortable sharing? What was your thought process, if you can recall? How did you share enough information that they could comprehend what had happened, but not so much information, particularly all the dialogue, the scams and the lies, that they wouldn't look at that and saying, how could you not have seen that?
I think in my case, it's possibly a bit different to experiences that others may have, for the simple fact that I really had no choice about whether I talked about it or not, because it was splashed everywhere across the world. But I think, you know, that is the hardest part. If I can just start, you know, from a hindsight perspective, I'm incredibly grateful for my experience now. And why I say that is because I was plunged into I was dragged out of denial is probably a better way to say it. So I had no choice. You know, I was confronted with it. I was there. It was happening. It was huge. And actually, at the time, the bigger issue was dealing with the fact that I'd been arrested and accused of being a drug mule. So the scam almost came second because that was the initial trauma. In terms of sharing my story, I've probably in many cases to my detriment, I've always been incredibly open. And so ask me a question and I'll give you an answer. And so for me, a lot of how my story was told was probably driven more by questions that I was asked. But I am genuine because not about the fact that I'm grateful for being arrested and plunged into prison. Now, the reason for that is because, as I said, it dragged me out of denial. Not that I came immediately out of denial, because I still hoped and prayed that he had also been set up as part of the scam. Well, you know, you hold on to what you can hold on to, and I own that. And I mean, I think it's important that we do that we actually say, you know, I did this even when my head was telling me this, my heart was telling me this. I did this. You know, the more we can voice it without blame, then I think the more comfortable we begin to feel. So my suggestion to people that are finding it difficult, and I've, you know, dealt with many of them over the years, is that they just take it one step at a time. So it might just be, look, I'm going through a really rough patch at the moment. I've been, you don't even have to share that it's a scam or whatever it is. Just let people know you're not in a good space, that something's happened, that you may not even be ready to talk about it yet, but you've been traumatized. You're not in a good space. You just need some support. And then, you know, you might, the person that's most closest to you, you might say, look, I feel really dumb. I feel really stupid, because that's still how you'll be feeling. So I just encourage people to be honest. And I hope that those that they go to are compassionate. I always remember one person that challenged me and, you know, just wanted to be argumentative. And I can't remember whether it was in an interview or where it was, but he just kept coming at me. And in the end, I said, hey, hold up. I said, I have to tell you, I feel really sorry for you. And he went, what do you mean? You feel sorry for me, sort of thing. I said, I just hope and pray that no member of your family ever gets scammed, because you're going to be no help to them whatsoever. Well, it set this guy back on his seat, and he went, my family wouldn't get scammed. I said, really? And he realized immediately that he'd sort of fallen into a false hope, and that he couldn't guarantee that no one in his family would get scammed. So I think...
Or himself.
Well, I think we're often more afraid of...
Exactly.
Of what people will think. But actually, if we're honest and if we're genuine, if they don't accept that, then it's their problem. It's not actually ours. You know, if they can't accept the fact that I was traumatized, that I went through something really horrific and everything else, and if they want to minimize it by saying I'm dumb and stupid, well, you know, I'd just say, oh, well, whatever, you know, but I'm at a point now that it doesn't hurt me. But when you're in those first few stages, yes, every comment hurts, every look hurts, every, you know, sigh that someone makes, you personalize it. But I think it is about accepting. The more we talk about it, the easier it gets. You know, I don't feel anything anymore. I mean, it's 11 years, just gone 11 years and a couple of weeks since I was arrested. Look, I have no trauma. I can even revisit in my head the moment that I was, you know, told, the moment I saw the drugs, all of that. I have no emotion. I have no emotion. I don't get that feeling in my tummy about the scammers. I don't get any of that anymore. The one thing I do have that I don't think will ever change for me, and I don't know if this is the same for others. You mentioned it before, Tim, when you said we're not the only victims. It's our families and our friends that become victims. And you can hear my voice start to thicken, because that is the one thing that I don't think I will ever be at peace with is the trauma that my daughter went through. So she is a very different, we're very similar in many ways, but she, as I mentioned before, I'm still trusting, she's not. She, so, you know, that even though I don't blame myself, and she certainly doesn't blame me, it's the one thing that emotionally still upsets me is the trauma that she went through. So my own trauma, good as gold. But my compassion and feeling for my daughter, who was 31 at the time, I think in many ways she had a rougher road, ride than I had. I was, you know, locked up in a surreal, unreal environment. I didn't have to deal with day-to-day issues. She did. So I'm always very conscious of that fact that while I've moved through it all, I'm not 100% sure my daughter has. You know, I've had the supports, I've had people, you know, talk to me about it and all of those things, but she's just supported me 100%, as you would have seen in the drama. Well, you haven't seen the drama, but, you know, as in the drama, you know, she participated in all of that, and meeting everybody. But that would be the one thing for me that's still left. But tell the story regardless. You know, if people are nasty or mean, well, that's what they are. They're nasty and mean. And I think we don't want them in your life.
And sometimes you lose friends. I lost friends over it. And that's okay, because I moved on to a different spot and they weren't willing to do that with me. And that was fine. But again, it's taken time for both of us to get to that point where it doesn't matter. And it does get stronger. And you know, your moment of getting arrested was my moment of seeing my guy, you know, on the screen live from Nigeria. We all needed that brick wall moment. And I think many of the victims don't have that, which is difficult because it's sometimes, you know, they want to keep believing that something's out there, but it just doesn't work out. And like me, I mean, like you, my greatest hurt was my mother and father, because I brought them in for 100,000. It took me 10 years to finally, you know, be able to get them a home and feel like I've paid back that, at least the money part. The emotion part, it was interesting because telling the story brought them so much closer to me, because they were with me the whole time after they went to the FBI. They, you know, we talked about everything. If anything, you know, my mom and dad are ultra sensitive about scammers now, because I'm like, don't answer that phone call that you don't know, don't do this, don't do that, you know, so they understand. But my father ended up writing his side of the story, which would have been the end of the movie. And you can imagine what he would have done, i.e. fly to Nigeria with, you know, something. And every man in my life, they all wanted to have the same ending to the story, and it was flying over to Nigeria and taking care of the guy. But it got us to talk it out. And if I were to write another book, my father, he's already got his ending. He's already got it ready. But another thing that I think was important that you and I both did is we kept those journals. I have 4,000 pages of what happened. I don't read it anymore. It's there. It was family history. The only time it comes out is when the reporters want something, you know, emotional, and they'll have me read a section. And that is a little bit of a trigger for that moment, but typically it's not. But it's something that we were able to get out. And that was the basis of my book, is probably a basis of some of your filming stuff. That was really important. We encouraged the victims today to start writing your story, because once you get it out, the emotions of what happened are released. And that's why you can speak up. That's why I can speak up, because it happened to us, but it doesn't define us.
No.
It's not us. That is not us. And I think a lot of our new victims, the scam is them, and they're in it. And it's very unsettling in so many ways, but you can get over it, and you will.
That's right, Debbie. Just on that word defining, I remember within days of my arrest, and, you know, the hardest part was letting my family know that I'd been arrested. However, they were very relieved, because they had me dead somewhere in some country in the world. So they were relieved I'd been arrested. But I remember my daughter saying to me within a week of my arrest, crying on the phone. We cried probably every time for the first 2 weeks that we spoke. And she's saying, you know, Mama, she said, this will never define you. This doesn't define you. This is not who you are. That was really important for me to hear at that time. Now it has defined how I've how I've been since that moment. So while it hasn't defined me as a person, there's many other things that I'd like to think define me, but what it's done is it has defined my actions moving forward. So if I had not have had that experience, none of this would be happening. So I'm quite clear about the fact that it was a defining moment. It hasn't defined who I am, but it has certainly defined the way that I've behaved moving forward.
Correct. I agree. Me too.
I have a question for you. Now, it appears from the outside that one of the great things that's happened as a result of your storytelling is that sort of the institutions of New Zealand have really accepted you as one of the foremost experts in your country to some extent. Well, you roll your eyes, but government, police, they refer victims to you for support, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Doesn't sound like that's always a perfect relationship. Don't want to go there. But what
maybe I might. Because I think it's an issue, actually, Tim.
Okay.
You're quite right. Yes, people refer victims to me. However, how do I put it? I've been doing this on a voluntary basis now, and don't get me wrong, anyone that watches this, please, if you know how to get a hold of me, continue to do so, because I have no issue with doing it on a voluntary basis.
We're all volunteers as well, Debbie and I.
That's right. When I have organisations here in New Zealand that run national conferences on this whole business and do not provide a victim's perspective, when
that's a problem.
There are other gatherings, when police come together to discuss things like this, those things my name doesn't even feature. So do they, no, I'm just convenient, and I'm being a bit facetious now, I'm convenient for those organisations to feel like they've done something. Oh, we've passed it on to Sharon Armstrong. One person in a country of 5 million.
Right.
Come on, So I'm still, and I know you guys have heard my frustrations around this. We have some good people, but we have very few strong advocates, or, I'm in a full-time job, which is unrelated to this, which does limit a lot of what I can do. And particularly because I work for one of our iwi, one of our tribes in social services, and we're funded, we receive government funding. So I'm somewhat muzzled in terms of how far I could go in pushing what I see as an issue that's actually still not being taken seriously enough in this country. And I know that I need to champion to get a member of parliament on my side. I don't really care what party they're from. I just want them to be a good advocate. But that's going to take me some time, and I need to be out of a full-time job in which to do that. So you're right, Tim. Yes, there's some recognition of me, but it's more a recognition as someone that they can palm, some of these victims off on, and then have a guilt-free conscience that they actually did something. So I don't believe I carry any weight. I don't believe that I'm sought upon as an expert other than to work with victims. So a little bit different.
I think in time it's going to happen, though. The more we get out there, and the more I think they're aware of what's happening. And because we're coming across so passionately, but not emotionally, and they can see that there is action that can be taken, I think in time, might be 10 years from now, when we don't have full-time jobs. We don't have full-time jobs, but I think we are gaining some credibility one step at a time.
Yep, true.
Part of where I was going with this question was, with your experience, both for yourself, because Debbie and I are in a little different position. We're both independent entrepreneurs and business people, so we don't have day jobs per se. But I know that you do work for one of the native nations there in New Zealand. In your experience, particularly talking to other victims, how judgmental do you think employers are? If a victim goes to them and admits the trauma that they've been through a scam, what do you think the stigma still is from an employer perspective? This is something that victims are very afraid of. Out, you know, I almost equate it to coming out of the closet. What are your thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of one particular victim. It came to me via her boss, who had made the first contact, and her boss had become aware that there was something not quite right, and had a little chat with her, with the woman concerned. And cut a long story short, the boss got in touch with me and asked whether I could support her worker. So that was a pretty good story, in that while the woman hadn't actually disclosed, she'd been talking about a relationship and the boss had gotten suspicious. So it took some work to actually pull the woman out of that denial. But I think most of them wouldn't tell their bosses. I just think that's the bottom line. I think most of them would hide it with not being well, or, you know, if they have to take some time off, they're taking time off for whatever reason. I don't know that they would be upfront. I certainly know when I came back, I was a hot potato and nobody really wanted to touch me. I remember, because, you know, I'd had a 20-year career in the public sector, and, you know, seen as a senior public servant when the media wanted to frame it that way. And yet it was pretty obvious, even though I had no conviction, which would have been a reason for them not to employ me. I have no conviction, so that was not a reason. And I don't even have a conviction in Argentina. So, you know, there was no reason why I was unemployable. But I remember a recruiting agency, until they knew my story, was so excited and said, "Oh, whereabouts in the public sector would you like to work? With your cultural competencies, we could get you in anywhere." And then I said to her, "Did you Google my name?" She said, "No." I said, "Well, I suggest you do." And so she did, and she came back in, and the whole interview changed. It was, she just made excuses, really. "Oh, I'll get back in touch with you in a few days," and never did. And in the end, I pushed her and I said, "You're telling me really I'm unemployable, aren't you?" She said, "Yes, I'm really sorry, Sharon. At this point in time, you are."
I think it's something that we need to bring up, though. And I mean, it's interesting, as I was asked to speak in September to the Human Resource Agency in the state of Georgia. And, you know, originally it was like, oh, the woman that got scammed. And I'm like, that's not what I want to talk about. I want to put it on you. How will you react to someone that will come to you and say, "This has happened to me," or they won't come to you, but you'll know that it happened. So we need to work on that. And you guys can help me, you know, draft that presentation, because it's important that they know. Because so many of our victims are like, "I can't speak up. I can't say anything. I work for the government. I work for financial agencies. And if they find out that I'm going to get fired, I'm going to lose my licenses." And, you know, we need to get past that we were responsible part. And they don't know that until they hear it.
Really, the only consequence that seems reasonable, only because I've been through it, and Debbie, you also held relatively high security clearances, is when I was scammed in 2001, I didn't lose my security clearance. DOD asked me questions. They wanted a copy of the FBI report, but I didn't lose my security clearance until I was forced, due to a business failure, to go through bankruptcy in 2005. But I can understand that concern and that fear, where if you're in a position of extreme trust, others not understanding this might view this in the terms of lapse of judgment or things of that nature, which it's not, but nevertheless.
But Tim, we've had guests on the show that are financial planners, and one in particular, one that we have in the drivers group, 42 years in the business, and she was taken up in a Ponzi scheme, you know, and so she was afraid that she was going to lose her license to the SEC. She was going to quit working in the financial services. And then she's like, "But I'm responsible for 30, you know, high wealth clients." And she goes, "I need to let them know that I got taken, which means that they could get taken." And it gave her credibility once she realized that she didn't have to climb out of that rock. And, you know, she was pretty low when it happened.
Absolutely true.
again, we have to get it out that it happens to everybody, and no matter what business we're in. But many aren't going to talk, and that's the problem. Until we start speaking up, they're not going to realize how well-intentioned, big-hearted, well-financed, well-trained people are being taken.
Yeah.
As an employer myself of hundreds of people, I personally would consider it a positive attribute if an employee came to me and said, look, I'm having a problem, and this is what it is, and this is what I'm experiencing, because that gives me as an employer an opportunity to be compassionate.
Yes.
More importantly, if I didn't know, I would just observe the symptoms.
Yeah.
And have to respond to just those symptoms more negatively. Knowing in advance what the underlying cause is, I'd make sure that that person got counseling. I'd make sure that we integrated this into our thought process from a human resource point of view as well. And I think that's a battle that we all have yet to really begin. We've been doing quite a bit in terms of trying to educate the corporate world through my affiliations in the cybersecurity world that your employees are not the problem. They're the solution, but if your employees become traumatized by this, your organization is going to suffer. So you need to take awareness that your employees are victims too, not just a corporation in the event of a cybersecurity attack. I think we're reaching the end of our hour. So let me ask Sharon if you have any final thoughts, whether you found this useful. Share some final tidbits of wisdom, because you certainly have achieved that lofty status of becoming wise. And I don't say that with sarcasm, quite honestly. I say that with admiration.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, I've always wanted to be wise. So, thank you for that. I guess, yeah, it's like, now you put the pressure on. My encouragement, to anyone that's watching this, I hope that there's something that's resonated with you. I hope that you maintain a belief that if you're not through this yet, you will get through it. Right. I guess if there was ever a message to give to victims, while today may feel like the worst day ever, the sun will come up again tomorrow and you get another day. And so, and it's a chance for it to be a better day than before. But overriding everything, to those of you that are still sitting in trauma, to those that may still even be in denial or whatever, just be kind to yourself. Because if we are harsh on ourselves, that gives everybody else permission to do the same. If we're kind to ourselves, that stops people in their tracks and they think, wow, maybe, just maybe there's something in this, but it is important. You will get through it, but you have to go through the process. Don't short circuit it. Don't jump into another relationship. Don't jump into another online relationship. Don't try to replace it with something else. Deal with it. Sit with it. Cry. Do all those things that you need to do, but move through it. Because seriously, life is good. I look forward to every single day. I have no regrets. I have learned a heap in the last 11 years of my life. I've met some wonderful people. I hope to meet many more wonderful people. It is an issue I will continue to advocate for and champion and stand up. I've loved the talk today. Corridor is our word for talk. I've loved it today. I love catching up with you guys. I know that you understand you're doing some magnificent work. Sorry, I don't get to contribute quite as much as I would like. I really want to join one of those Zoom hui at one point. The time difference, of course, is always an issue, but I'm sure we've managed it today. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for all the hard work that you do, and best of luck to everybody watching this. You will get through it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sharon. Debbie, any final thoughts?
Oh my gosh, ditto on what she just said. But yeah, I was just saying, learn as much as you can. I really enjoy reading the articles. I read a new one today on the scars on romancescamsnow.com. It's incredible. It helps me to stay positive, helps me to be able to answer questions, especially when I'm up against the media. The greatest thing I can say is seek support. This is not something you want to do alone. You don't have to do alone. There are many of us out there. And that's what I want you to remember is you are not alone. You are not alone in this. You have at least 3 of us here. And the organization is fantastic. And I appreciate Sharon and her story. And like I said, we're sisters by other misters. And there are many of us out there in the same boat that have been through this. And it is just a stepping stone in our life. And we can get through it, and we will get through it, and we will be better for it, especially as we pay it forward and tell our story to someone else so that they don't get hurt.
Yep. Well, we're very pleased to have partners in over 60 countries around the world. So we do support scam victims and their families worldwide. So contact us. And if we have a partner organization in your particular country, like Waspada Scammer Sinta in Indonesia, which is 30+ volunteers, or our team in Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Japan, etc. SCARS has a complete Latin American organization for the Spanish-speaking countries. Contact us. We'll place you with the right people and send you in the right direction. No hate, no judgment, but we're brutally honest. So I want to thank both of you for joining me today. It's been an outstanding conversation, very appreciative. This has been a video of the Society of Citizens Against Relationship Scams Incorporated, a government-registered crime victims assistance and crime prevention nonprofit organization based in Miami, Florida. This video is copyright 2022 SCARS. So feel free to contact us at contact@againstscams.org. Visit our websites, romancescamsnow.com for our encyclopedia of romance and relationship scams. Remember to report scams no matter where you are in the world. It begins with your local police. Remember, they may not be terribly understanding, but you only have 2 objectives when you go to them. One is get the report done, get a report number, because that gives you access to many benefits, depending upon where you are in the world. And more importantly, it's your first exercise of your personal power, recovering control from the criminals that stole it from you. So thank you, everyone. This has been Dr. Tim McGuinness, and thank you to my guests, Sharon Armstrong from New Zealand and Debby Montgomery Johnson from deepest, darkest Palm Beach, Florida. Have a great week, everyone. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.